This year actually starts off on a down note with one that arrived on January 29th with One Glorious Day, which had Will Rogers and Alan Hale Sr. in it. It was a comedy horror film about a ghost named EK that would take over a man's body and go have fun while the man would try to get it back. It was a bit notorious since it was originally meant for Fatty Arbuckle to star in it, but shortly before filming, he had his infamous scandal and had to drop out. It is, however, a lost film, and no copies are known to exist. This next one arrived in Germany on March 15th and truly made history because that's the day that the world first met Nosferatu. We're told about a town called Weisborg and a man named Hutter who had a wife, and look at that, 100 years ago and movies knew that success meant putting a cat in your movie. He works for a guy named Knock with a dazzling hairdo and eyebrow combo and gets a summons from a man named Count Orlac who wants to buy some local property, although his letter is written in what appears to be the doodles I would make in the margins of my school notebooks. It's said to be a somewhat perilous trip, so Ellen is worried, and he heads off into the Carpathian Mountains. The locals there seem deeply afraid of Orlac, including this guy, and you'd think a dude with a mustache like this wouldn't be afraid of anything. After some difficulty getting there, he finally reaches the castle and is met by Orlac, who is this odd-looking man with weird eyebrows. And yeah, really, in a world where Knock is a regular guy, why is Orlac that much creepier? The Count shows an unusual attraction to blood and an aversion to sunlight, and Hutter wakes up the next day with what he thinks are mosquito bites on his neck. He's oblivious at first, but soon starts to figure out that his host is indeed a vampire. His wife has premonitions about it, all the while the evil Count skulks around menacingly. Hutter escapes, and shortly after, Orlac makes his way to Weisborg, bringing the rats and plague along with him, intent on claiming Ellen for his own. And if all of that sounds vaguely familiar, it's because it sounds exactly like Dracula. This was actually an unauthorized adaptation of the Bram Stoker Dracula novel, and quite a few details were carried over wholesale. The similarities were so great that Stoker's estate sued them, and I'll get back to that in a moment. At this point in cinema, there were no vampire films, only films with female vampires or vamps, who were just human women luring men into temptation. This was officially the first film to feature a supernatural creature vampire. It was directed by F.W. Murnau, who did last year's The Haunted Castle, and he wanted Conrad Veidt, the man who played Cesare in the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, to play the Count, but he was unavailable, so they cast then unknown Max Schreck. It was done on a fairly low budget, which made some of the shoot difficult, particularly since they only had one camera available. It was actually quite a big hit and made Murnau into a major player, and it was also rather acclaimed, pushing the vampire into the spotlight. And oh yeah, about that, this movie is where the idea of vampires dying in the sunlight comes from, as lore before this showed them merely uncomfortable in the sun, although it wasn't fatal. But then there was that lawsuit. The Stokers won the suit, and a court declared the film to be plagiarism and ordered all copies to be destroyed. Luckily, though, a number of prints survived and over time have been restored, and it's now seen as the classic that it is. There's also been a number of remakes, including a rather big one from 1979 with Klaus Kinski, and of course a brand new version by Robert Eggers with Bill Skarsgård as the Count. And I'll give this a 4. It's a pretty powerful film, and I can certainly acknowledge its achievements and impacts, although it's not one that I love watching. I do like to watch it, but it's not one I would just throw on for the hell of it. Its significance is a 4.5 since it's the first vampire film and helped define the lore, but I can't give it the full 5 because it's not been something that the mass public has seen and will always be in Drac's shadow. Should you watch it? Yes, indeed. The Count commands it. Our next entry fast forwards all the way to September 10th, and it's a horror comedy called The Ghost Breaker. It was a story about a man helping out a young woman that rid her father's mansions of ghosts, which may or may not be fake, and it had Wallace Reed in the lead, and this was later remade into The Ghost Breakers in 1940 with Bob Hope. This version, however, is now lost. We now go to a film that first debuted in Sweden on September 18th for a really bizarre one, and a film that wouldn't make it into the US until 1929, and it's Häxan. It begins with a dissertation of sorts about early cultures and the prominence of occult imagery, showing us how early time saw the model of the universe. It shows the outer reaches and then also a deeper core, which is meant to be hell, and gives instructions on how to ward off witches. Everything is shown to us through a series of illustrations and carvings, and we find out about superstitions around witchcraft. It then becomes a narrative film, and we have a couple of witches in a cabin pulling out rotted hands and brewing potions. A woman comes by looking to buy a love potion from Karna, and she uses it to win over this monk. And I mean, look at this guy. Who wouldn't want to fall in love with them, right? This lady's like, I want this burping, spitting man who looks suspiciously like cow gas. But the devil shows up, and look at this thing. This is pretty awesome for 1922, and it tempts a young woman, and then another witch who dreams of a castle and riches. This portion has some stop-motion animation even. Like, look at this little fella. But then there's demon costumes and fantastic sets. There's then another segment about a guy who has died, and his family blames a local woman and says she's a witch who cursed him, and then continues in that manner, with the film giving demonstrations on how witchcraft was then dealt with. And this is such an odd film. It's unlike anything else from this whole period. It was both written and directed by Benjamin Christensen, a Danish man who had made 2 previous films and would continue on until 1942. And we'll discuss him again in a little bit later in the 20s as well. It was the most expensive Scandinavian film made up until this point, with a cost of 2 million kroner, and it was inspired by Christensen's own fascination with the history of witch hunting. He had found this book called the Malleus Maleficarum and spent the next couple of years studying it and similar manuals about witches. And his intention was to make something original as opposed to simply adapting a book or play, which was the standard at that time. At the time, it received a fair amount of backlash, as several countries were offended by the inclusion of scenes of torture, nudity, and what they called sexual perversion. And also since it had a somewhat unfavorable view of the religious and portrayed them as blindly lashing out against things that they didn't understand and calling them evil and destroying them because some things never change, right? It would go on to a cult success and would end up being re-released in '68 in an altered form, now called Witchcraft Through the Ages, and featured a narration by none other than William S. Burroughs, who likely made this whole thing less surreal, I'm sure. And, my guys, this is a 4. This is so well crafted, and the effects are stunning for the time. And surprise, surprise, that it's actually a reasoned response to the fear-mongering about witchcraft and the occult. Its significance is a 2.5 since it's grown a pretty sizable following of the years, and is one of the more discussed films of the time period, but it's never been widely seen, and is a cult film at best. Should you watch it? Absolutely get witchy with it. Let's go back to America now for an entry that arrived on November 5th, as we reach the end of the year with The Headless Horseman. It's set in 1790 in the town of Sleepy Hollow, and we meet Katrina, the most sought-after woman in town. She's enamored with a big hunk of a man named Van Brunt, but one day the new school teacher comes into town, and he's Ichabod Crane, of course. He's played by legendary actor and Connecticut Yankee Will Rogers, and his appearance immediately rankles some people, but there's also the local legends. There's a story of a mysterious headless horseman who's said to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper that lost his head in the battle and spends the nights searching for it. Icky goes to work, and oh man, the kid in the dunce cap. I know that this was a real thing, but I had to look it up, and it was mostly implemented in the 19th and early 20th centuries and was considered a mean-spirited punishment even during its time. Mr. Crane is fascinated by ghost stories and witchcraft and tells tales to everyone, which is seen as unprofessional by other townspeople, and he soon ends up in a love triangle with himself, Katrina, and Van Brunt. Much of the film deals with that, and Van Brunt trying to make it look like Crane is involved with a group of witches and is in league with the devil, and Ichabod's efforts to prove his innocent, which pretty much the entire first hour of this movie is devoted to this subplot. And oh my god, does Ichabod live in the Amityville house? What the hell? And yeah, this movie is only an hour and a couple of minutes long, and there's no Headless Horseman action until the final couple of minutes. And this was a directorial debut for Edward Venturini, and he had a pretty short career and only directed a handful of pictures, with the final one being in 1939. It was an unusual role for Rogers, who was mainly cast in a heroic role, so playing a nerdy type who is pretty harsh on children was against the type. It was the first black and white film to use panchromatic stock, a more expensive film that was a higher quality and gave more accurate tones than the standard orthochromatic stock. Although several adaptations of the tale had been done during the silent period, this is the only one that survives and can still be seen. And this is a slog. It's a 1.5 from me. It's dull and flat and spends way too much time with the fake witchcraft plot and not enough of what we want to see. A Headless Horseman in a movie called The Headless Horseman. Its significance is the same since it's not a much discussed version of the tale, and were it not for Rogers' involvement, didn't have any notable names. Should you watch it, you can likely leave this one. The next one debuted on December 3rd and had a bigger rollout a week later on the 10th, and it was called A Blind Bargain. This was by Wallace Worsley, a man we'll discuss a little later on in the episode, and featured Lon Chaney as a mad doctor who creates an ape man with the actor playing both roles. It had a hard time with censors since they claimed that it was about a man attempting to play God and creating artificial life, and was cut down drastically and was quite successful, but the last surviving print is thought to have been destroyed in a fire in 1931 and is now completely lost. This next one came out a touch earlier in the year in Istanbul, not Constantinople, but it had its premiere on December 31st of 1922, but it went wider in February of 23. And Salomé. Sorry, I'm just really hungry. This begins with a quick rundown of the biblical story of King Herod and John the Baptist. It's in the king's court, and beautiful Salomé is here and given a bit too much attention from her stepdad, which pisses off his wife, but maybe he was just fascinated by her hair lights. Or these guys' hair balls. Everyone's got really cool hair things going on here. And hats. Look at these wonderful hats. Like, I have no idea what's going on here, but I'm somewhat angry that I can't have this hairstyle. She asks to see a prisoner named Jokanan, and she's pretty infatuated with him, much to the chagrin of the Tetrarch. There's some dancing and moping and more dancing as Jokanan spurs Salomé's affections, and the price of a kiss is a dance before the king, with grisly results. And yes, this is a version of the Bible story, but it's more of an adaptation of the Oscar Wilde play from 1891 that was also called Salomé. It was there that the character's name was changed to Jokanan, as opposed to John, and was adapted by Charles Bryant and Alla Nazimova, who also plays Salomé. Because of its general lack of a storyline and greater emphasis on visual stylings, it's often referred to as one of the very first art films, created more for an aesthetic than to tell a specific plot. Weirdly, even though most of the film takes place on a single stage, it was very expensive to make, running a tab of more than $350,000. Because everything had to be built and built indoors, and all of the crazy costumes had to be handmade, it tallied up costs rather quickly. It was super controversial at the time, and its artsy backdrops caused every major studio to back away from it, so it became an entirely independent production and took a long time to find anyone to distribute it. When it did, it was a failure, and Nazimova, who was also the producer on it, dropped out of the producing game and stuck strictly to acting afterwards. It's said to be an early standout for gay and lesbian filmmaking, as a large chunk of the cast was rumored to be either gay or bisexual, and prominently featured characters in drag. And it originally went even further, featuring a depiction of a relationship between two male soldiers, although those scenes ended up being cut out. And it's hard to judge this one, so I'll go with a 3.5. It's super pretty and just fascinating to look at, and there's always something cool going on. But it's also not exactly a film you can get wrapped up in the plot for, since it isn't one. Its significance is a 2.5, since it is slightly more known and a famous tale, but perhaps not the most known take on it, but it did have a solid impact on the art world over time. Should you watch it? Yes, get wrapped up in her dance. We're headed into 1932 now, and the first one came out on May 8th, and it was called While Paris Sleeps. This had Victor McLaglen as a man sentenced to life in prison for murder who escapes to Paris and finds his daughter. There, he has to try to keep her safe from those trying to take advantage of her, while also remaining unfound. It was from Maurice Tournier, who had been directing since 1912, with most of his works in France, and this was made in 1920 under the title The Glory of Love, but not released until 1923, where it was given the new name While Paris Sleeps. And this is another that is lost, with only posters and stills existing. This next one is from halfway through the year, on June 7th, and is The Last Moment. This had Henry Hull from Werewolf of London, and features a ship with a big nasty captain, and his big ape-like monster that he uses on his enemies. It was the final film for J. Parker Reed Jr., who only directed 5 films, with this being the last one, but this is also lost. And that takes us to September 6th for a film that's not lost, and maybe the most known for the era, and it's The Hunchback of Notre Dame. It's at the famous cathedral in 1482, and we meet Quasimodo right off the bat with that iconic makeup, and he's played by none other than Lon Chaney in the role that he's likely most known for. There's a guy named Clopin, who is dubbed the King of the Beggars, and a guy named Jehan, the brother of the church's archdeacon, who is a good guy named Dom Claude. Quasi freaks everyone out, and he works for Jehan, and Clopin has a woman that he has raised as his daughter named Esmeralda, but her and her father are scorned by the townspeople. One night she goes to dance, and Jehan becomes enamored with her, so he sends Mr. Moto after her to kidnap. Thankfully, the soldier Phoebus is there to rescue her, and Quasi is captured, abandoned by his dick boss. When he's ordered to be punished for the crime, he's taken to the town square and meant to be lashed, and his misshapen body is revealed. However, Esmeralda takes pity on him and brings him water in an act of kindness, and also falls in love with Phoebus. But then things get problematic when Clopin disapproves of her new love, as does Jehan, and it kicks off some murder and uprisings. And remember a few minutes ago when I said that we talk about Wallace Worsley again? Well, he directed this one too, and it was by Universal. It could maybe be considered the first Universal monster pick, although it's a stretch to call Quasi a monster. The character was a dream role for Chaney. He had been trying to get a version of the film made himself, and there were even a couple of false starts with other directors and companies before this. When Universal finally agreed to make it, Chaney suggested Worsley, since they had just worked together on A Blind Bargain, and on a few films before that. It was very expensive for the time, and it's estimated to have cost between $750K to $1 million, and was officially the priciest Chaney film ever made. It paid off since it was a massive hit, grossing $3.5 million and becoming Universal's most successful silent film. Unfortunately, the original negatives and the old prints no longer exist, and the only versions still out there are 16mm prints for home viewing, and are of a lower quality. Attempts have been made to restore the film and improve the film quality, and those have been released on Blu-ray in recent years. And I'll go for a 3.5 on this one. It's a great version of the tale. It could stand to be a bit more stylish, though, and the story does drag a touch, but it's some really good stuff. Its HCS is a 4.5, though, since it's one of the more known films of this era and kicked off Universal's interest in horror films, setting the stage for an onslaught to come in the next decade and more. Should you watch it? Yep, this ain't no Disney version. Now we're headed back over to Germany, a place that we've been a lot in the 20s for a film that premiered there on October 16th and eventually ran in the US, but not until 1927, and it's Warning Shadows. I guess the German title for this was closer to Shadows, a Nocturnal Hallucination, and we're introduced to the characters in this little shadow play, and very coolly told, it's Act 1, by way of a finger. You have this wealthy count, and he's rather jealous of how much attention that his wife gets, and her guy friends that seem to like to egg him on through the use of shadows, and she seems to enjoy making him a bit crazy. And one thing to point out here is that unlike a lot of the other silents, there doesn't appear to be any intertitles, so all of the events are determined simply by actions alone. This was apparently done in an effort to create a pure film, and utilize the abilities of cinema that weren't available to other forms of art, such as moving images. As the night goes on, they continue with the puppet shows using shadows, and where's a killer clown when you need one, right? But then, an oddball of a man shows up and sets up our second act, and he's referred to as the Shadow Player. He has this massive candelabra that he carries around with him everywhere, and he puts on a show, while also seemingly stoking the flames of the Count's green-eyed monster. He then uses some sort of magic, and everyone is transported to a hallucinatory realm where they get these prolonged visions about what the Count will do if they keep making moves on his wife. And this was by a man named Arthur Robeson, and due to the use of shadows and such a large number of scenes throughout, it's often labeled as a great example of German expressionism. And even though it's not as well known as some of the others, it's often referred to as being as important as them. There were a number of people here that were also involved with Nosferatu, including Alexander Grenache, who plays the Shadow Player, and he was Knock in that other film. Unfortunately, this one didn't quite leave a mark and fell by the wayside in terms of public attention and has slipped into relative obscurity, although it's still held up by some as being a visual pioneer's film. And I'm giving it a 3.5. It's doing so many cool visual tricks with lights and shadows that it's just a delight to watch, although the plot is pretty unengaging and it's definitely a touch long for the subject matter. But visually, it's outstanding. Its significance is just a 1.5 since it's fairly lost to time, but it does get discussed when German expressionism is brought up. Should you watch it? It depends. If you're interested in seeing them do cool shot after cool shot with shadows, then yes. If you're looking for a solid story, probably not. The final entry of 1923 came out on December 16th, although Wikipedia says February of 1924, and AFI backs that up and says that there were some delays with it, so it's unclear when the actual release was, but it's The Wolfman. Now, this isn't some werewolf film that you were unaware of, as it was just about a man who turns into a wolf when he drinks a lot, and wolf is used in the connotations of being a predatory jerk. It was by Edmund Mortimer and starred John Gilbert and Norma Shearer, but this one is currently lost completely. We're now into 1924, and on January 27th, there was one called The Shadow of the East, which was also called The Shadow of the Desert. It was based on a novel with the same name and involved a death curse from India. It was by a French director named Georges Archambaud and was weird because its ad said that it was a sequel to a 1921 movie called The Sheikh, although it was simply based on a book by the same author, and The Sheikh had its own sequels later on. This is another one that is also lost though and is unable to view. Believe it or not, but our next one jumps all the way to September 7th, and we're back in the United States with Dante's Inferno. We're introduced to sleazy businessman Mortimer Judd, and really, why did I say sleazy there? Isn't that just sort of assumed? He has a son named Ernest, and I guess they have some sort of record player that shows video images, and a pretty sick 1924 burn. Mortimer is also a slumlord and all-around bad guy, and his wife is very sick. And one day he receives a copy of Dante's Inferno in the mail. As he reads it, he sees visions formed from the book, including that classic abandon all hope thing, and we get views of what's going on down there, and the standard horned demons and hellfire, and as he's reading, he's watched over by a demon. Meanwhile, his kids seem to be kinder hearted than he is, try to get him to soften up, but he's nasty to his tenants, which drives one of them to commit suicide. He even kicks his own son out of the house because he finds him trysting with a maid, and that neighbor's death places a curse on him, which results in him facing a trial in hell. So, this was by Henry Otto, a man who had been directing since 1912, mostly shorts, and this was actually one of his very last works. It was an adaptation of Inferno, just one section of the poem Divine Comedy. It embellishes that, though, with an almost Scrooge element as Judd is forced by these spirits to confront his own greed. There was an earlier version of this back in 1911 called Inferno from Italy, and it would get another shot in 1935 as Dante's Inferno again. This version features some odd quirks in it. There's a character in blackface, and he was a rather famed and noted comic actor, so he was instantly recognized, which seems to have caused some laughs in early screenings. It was also noted for featuring more nudity than usual, as a number of the denizens of hell are completely naked. It's said that when it was released in New York, it had a record-breaking total of $3,000 in one day, and that audiences were bigger than usual, although no real numbers exist to get a final number. And this is fine, it's a 2.5 from me, and that might have been higher if there existed a better print, because it's hard to see what was going on in hell at times. But it's okay, it just gets a touch monotonous after a while. Its HCS is a 2, since it's the first American shake at this tale, but not really the most known and didn't really have much in the way of names. Should you watch it, it's fairly skippable, but a decent watch. Just a bit later, on September 18th, there was a release called A Son of Satan that was written, directed, produced, and distributed by one man, Oscar Micheaux, a black man hailed as the first major African-American filmmaker. This film involved a man taking a bet to spend a single night in a legendary haunted house, but is sadly also now lost. Very shortly after, in Germany, on September 24th, there was an entry that wouldn't get a US release until June of 1928, and it's The Hands of Orlac. This has Orlac, a constant pianist, and he's played by Conrad Veidt, who we've already seen in The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and his wife is awaiting his return. However, his train crashes, and after a desperate search, they find him in the wreckage, still alive. Meanwhile, a criminal named Vasseur is scheduled to be executed, and when they get Paul to the hospital, it's revealed that his hands cannot be saved. Since they're his entire life and career, his wife begs the doctor to do something, and when she sees them bringing in Vasseur's body, he decides to take drastic measures and transplants his hands. Right away, though, troubles arise as Orlac sees a mysterious man laughing at him that disappears and visions of murder. They start to dominate his life, so he pleads with the doctor to take them back off, but he refuses, as the urge to kill is not in the hands, but the mind. The plot thickens, though, when a man claiming to be Vasseur, with his head transplanted onto another body, shows up. And this one is, again, by Robert Wiene, who we've been discussing quite a lot. He did The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, as well as Genuine, The Tragedy of a Vampire, and he was very much a part of the whole German Expressionist movement. Although this film doesn't truly fall into that category, and in fact, there's some argument as to whether it can be considered an example of it. It was based on a book called Hands of Orlac, a book from 1920, and if the story sounds familiar, it's because it was later adapted into Mad Love, a film I covered on the 30s Project. It did quite well when it was released, and the reviews were strong, praising the visual stylings. It was commented that the plotline is fairly standard and not extremely original, but that Wine's artistic flourishes set it apart from all of the others of the era. There was a bit of an issue with censors, though, since they thought that some of the demonstrations of criminal behaviors and ways to evade police might be used in real life. And the film would give people, heaven forbid, ideas. However, it was eventually deemed too unrealistic to be taken seriously and passed the board. And I thought this one was fairly entertaining, so I'm going to go ahead and give it a 3. It doesn't really do anything too profound, and it's really not that great of a story, but it is a fun one and worth watching. Its horror cultural significance is a 2, though, since it's a slightly more well-known title and had Wine at the helm and had Veidt in the lead. Should you watch it? I'd say yes. I'd say give this one a hand. Our final film of 1924 came out in Germany on November 13th and didn't get a release in the US until 5 years later in 1929, and it's Waxworks, with an S, and Zach Galligan ain't it this. It's set in a circus, and there's a wax museum there, and the proprietor hires a young writer to create a story about some of his figures. He agrees and gets to work, and since the wax figure of Harun al-Rashid had lost an arm, he decides to tell a story about how he got that way. And, lady, maybe some space? Like, geez, ma'am, maybe like 2 feet back? He then begins his story and imagines himself as a baker who's married, and al-Rashid is here, and he was an actual notorious caliph of Baghdad. When smoke from the baker's ovens causes al-Rashid to lose a game of chess, he's angered and wants to claim his head, but instead falls for his wife. He sneaks out to see her and oversees Assad plotting to steal his wishing ring. And like, the guy has a wishing ring. Why didn't he just wish to win that game of chess? Better yet, just wish for the wife to come up and fall in love with him. It sounds like a sucky wishing ring to me. But will Assad get the ring? Will his wife ditch him for riches and powers? And how about that dude's arm? This second story is about Ivan the Terrible, played by Conrad Veidt, who is just all over the 20s Project and looks different every time. Here, Ivan really loves to poison people, so much so that he has this guy called the Poison Mixer, who has an hourglass that keeps track of how much time it would take for a victim to be overcome by their poison. But the mixer double-crosses him and instead writes Ivan's name. The final story is about Jack the Ripper, although the available print calls him Spring-Heel Jack, and I'll talk about that in a second. But here, the Ripper instead comes to life to threaten our young poet. And this one is by Paul Lenny and Leo Berinsky, and teetered on the horror genre, since parts of it are clearly comedy. Originally, it was screened in a different order, showing the Ivan the Terrible segment first, and then the Jack the Ripper bit, with the Caliph story ending the show. Later, however, it was restored back to this order, which is how it was originally intended and scripted. Most of the versions of the film didn't survive, though, and the original German edition is now lost. This surviving copy is from a British print, which substituted Spring-Heel Jack for Jack the Ripper in order to get around British censors who wouldn't allow the portrayal of a real-life murderer. It has since been restored and given a new score, but there was also an infamous live performance in 2013 in which Mike Patton of Faith No More and Mr. Bungle performed with a trio of percussionists to do a live score for it, which can be seen on YouTube. And this is a 3. There's some fun moments here, but it's a little lightweight, although it's a pretty early take on the horror anthology. Its significance is just a 1.5 since it's not well known and didn't make a big impact, but it does have some notoriety going for it. Should you watch it? Yes. I mean, would you like to take a closer look?